Aha. So now, once again, we're at class 2 of the Jewish Foundation of the Life of the Messiah. I was doing some figuring today because each of these classes in the outline that we are basing, although as you can, if you just look, you see I'm doing far more than just their outline. Those are my extra notes all over the place, some of which I can barely read. But since we run, each of these classes originally supposed to last about 90 minutes. I have about 30 minutes for each class to do on Sunday mornings and Wednesday nights. That means it takes about 3 classes to do 1 class. There are 51 classes. So, no, not 51, I'm sorry, 27 classes. Anyway, it comes out to be about 100 classes if I can stay on track. So we'll be here for a while, but hopefully no one drops dead before we complete it. Well, praise, if we're raptured first, we'll ask the Lord if we can meet and continue in the study. All right, as we get into this tonight, we just want to constantly remember that as we are studying, we're looking at the themes of the Gospels, this introductory session of things. The themes of the Gospel tell us that each of the 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, wrote for a specific purpose, to accomplish a specific goal. And to do that, they came at it from a little different perspective in each case. But it is all inspired by the Holy Spirit. It is exactly what the Lord wanted to be written down. The doctrine of the inspiration of the Scriptures is that although God used human writers, what they wrote using their own idioms, their own vocabulary, their own ways of writing, their own styles, the Lord so superintended that everything they wrote down to the slightest letter was exactly what he wanted to be written, what exactly God wanted to be written. All Scripture, it says, is inspired by God or is God breathed. And so we looked last time at the various themes and how each writer looked at different aspects of the life of Christ and selected some out of those aspects to go along with his theme. They are not contradictory, but they were selected to demonstrate something. For example, in Matthew, his theme was that Jesus, or Yeshua, was the Messiah, the King of the Jews. And a large part of what he wrote was not only to prove that Jesus was the long-promised Messiah that the prophets wrote about and so forth in the Old Testament, but also he was answering the question that if Jesus was the Messiah, how come the kingdom did not come in? We studied that last time. So he presents then Matthew presents Jesus as the Messiah, the King of the Jews. Now we're going to look tonight at Mark. Mark wrote to present Yeshua, the Messiah, as the servant of Jehovah, the servant of God the Father. John Mark is the one that wrote it. He was the son of a wealthy woman whose home was large enough that they were able to hold church meetings in the early church with many of the disciples. You can see that in Acts 12. He traveled with Paul and Barnabas on the first missionary journey, but he failed to stay. Now, he joined Paul and Barnabas. He was related to Barnabas on that first missionary journey of the church. That happened in about 46 to 48 AD. He went as far as the country of Cyprus, the island of Cyprus, but then he left the team and he returned to Jerusalem. There is Paul's first missionary journey. They left out of Antioch, and then went to Cyprus, all the way over into Galatia, and then back again to Antioch. A total missionary journey, the first missionary journey of the church, of about 1,400 miles. However, Mark stopped there. If you see on the island of Cyprus, Paphos, he stopped there and he went back to Jerusalem. That didn't make Paul very happy. Paul very much disapproved of what John Mark did, and he initially didn't trust him to go on a second missionary journey. Barnabas wanted to bring him along. Paul and Barnabas argued. You can read about it in Acts 13, verses 36 through 40. And as a matter of fact, it caused a split between Barnabas and Paul. They went two different directions because they said that the argument between them was so sharp. However, later on, you find out in 2 Timothy that he's now serving Paul faithfully. So he corrected his fault. Also, he became Peter's right-hand man. He was a first-hand witness to everything that Peter was saying. In 1 Peter 5:13, Peter calls him my son, Mark, is how close they were. And he was Peter's amanuensis. I'll say it right if it kills me. Amanuensis. In other words, a secretary, somebody that you gave dictation to and wrote down. So most of what you see in 1st and 2nd Peter was written by Mark, but Peter is the one who is giving, or who is doing the writing. And tradition tells us that Mark's gospel may have been one of the very first ones of all of the gospels written, and that it was written in Rome. What's interesting is a comment that I found from Harry Ironside, where he said this: "It is like God to select the one-time unfaithful servant to tell the story of the ever-faithful servant, his own blessed son." Isn't that God? I mean, that's like a yay God, go God moment, isn't it? So Mark then, he was writing to prove that the Messiah was the servant of Jehovah, but his target audience was different. Matthew was writing to the Jews. Mark was writing to the Romans. The context is the Roman Empire that controlled Israel, and they had a vast empire. As a matter of fact, that's the Roman Empire at about the time of the writing of Mark, or the time of Christ. It's a little past it, but it's around in that neighborhood, the Roman Empire. He presents the Messiah as an ideal Roman. Not that he was Roman, not that he was Gentile, but the Romans believed that they were men of action. So when you are looking at the Gospel of Mark, you see that Jesus is a man of action. That was the ideal Roman. The way they wanted men to be was you could receive an order, or you could receive a commission, or you could receive an assignment, and you would immediately go in a hurry and carry it out and return being successful. One of the things that reinforces the fact that he is presenting Jesus as the servant is that there is no genealogy in Mark. Now, why would there be no genealogy in Mark? Simple answer. The Romans could care less about the genealogy of a servant. They didn't want to hear it. They weren't interested in it. They didn't care where you came from. As long as you did what you were supposed to do, they were happy with you. So it was written to the Roman mindset to focus on the Messiah as a man of action. More than what he taught, he was a man of action. He used the Greek word euthos some 42 times. Now that's translated straight away, forthwith, immediately. In other words, this constant sense of urgency is in Mark. As a matter of fact, if you read it, you kind of get caught up in it, and you feel like you almost, I've caught myself doing it, almost need to read faster because everything's happening so fast. He uses that word more often than all the rest of the New Testament combined. Because he was writing to the Romans, he had to come at it from their mindset. He used that motive as the servant carried out his mission that he was called to perform. God the Father had given him a commission. He took it and he carried it out. The Messiah was the servant of the Most High. And he quickly acted, and he was successful in carrying out his assignment at every point. So in Mark, Jesus is the ever faithful servant, the ideal man in the eyes of a Roman. So Yeshua of Nazareth fulfilled what Isaiah said about the servant of Jehovah. So Mark did not forget about the Jewishness of Jesus. Because in Isaiah, he constantly referred to him as the servant. In Isaiah, it was the servant of Yahweh, the servant of Jehovah, or the servant of the Lord. And that's exactly how he was presented, or is presented, in the Gospel of Mark. So he uses that title to show how Jesus fulfills those passages. In addition to that, Mark explains Jewish traditions as he goes along, because the Romans had no clue, or very little. So Mark's gospel points to Jesus as then the suffering servant of Isaiah 53, verse 11. What is the suffering servant in Isaiah 53, verse 11? It is the one who is going to be the substitute for sin. So because of that, in Arnold Fruchterbaum's work, he says it portrays Yeshua as the Son of God, the Son of Man, and the Messiah, who was crucified by his own people. And that's why Mark's gospel has sometimes been referred to as the gospel of the cross. In 16 short, quick chapters, that's how he shows who Jesus is. So that's why he focuses on action far more than what Jesus taught, or more than what he said, because that sense of urgency about accomplishing the mission is his focus. It pictures Jesus, who is not only one who receives a commission and is ready to carry it out, but one who is successful. Among the Romans, those who were unsuccessful in carrying out what they were told to do as a servant could lead to the death of the servant. It certainly diminishes that servant in value as far as the Romans are concerned. But Jesus always carried it out successfully. He was the servant of the Most High, the ever faithful servant. So now, here's a couple of questions for you. As we've looked at Mark, let's move over for the next few minutes into Luke. Let's see how much you can remember. Matthew wrote primarily to what group of people? The Jews. Mark wrote primarily to what group? The Romans. Other than Luke, the Gospel of Luke, what other book in the Bible did Luke write? The book of Acts. Who said that? Bruce did. He gets a gold star. He's the teacher's pet tonight. And it is only because he's wearing his gnome hat. Yeah. So he wrote the book of Acts. As a matter of fact, if you have your harmony, go to the paragraph 1 to Luke chapter 1, verses 1 through 4. Luke writes, and you need to underline a couple of important points in these verses. Inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile an account of the things accomplished among us, and probably both Matthew and Mark were already written when Luke wrote his, just as they were handed down, underline handed down, to us by those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. It seemed fitting for me as well, having, underlined this, investigated everything carefully, from the beginning, that is the beginning of the life of Christ, to write it out for you in consecutive order. Note that, in consecutive order. And he then writes, most excellent Theophilus. So both Luke and Acts were written to a man by the name of Theophilus. We know nothing more about Theophilus than his name. We don't know if he was Jew or Gentile. His name leans into being Greek. And my opinion is he was probably Greek because Luke is, as you'll find out in a second, Luke is focusing in on the Greeks. So he said, that you may know the exact truth about the things you have been taught. Now, does that mean Theophilus was a believer or not? We don't know. But if he's saying that I'm giving you, filling out all of these things in consecutive order, the things you have been taught, he's saying you've already been taught these things. You already know these things, which probably means he was part of the church. Probably means he may have even been taught by the apostles. We don't know, but I'm just surmising. But those things that you underline will become important here in just a moment. A little bit about Luke. First off, he's going to write about Yeshua the Messiah and present him as the Son of Man. The Son of Man. Luke was a physician. He was the first trained medical missionary. He accompanied Paul on some of his missionary journeys. Luke may have been from Antioch. Theophilus was from Antioch, so maybe that's where he met him. Theophilus apparently was a wealthy government official in Antioch, from what we can assume, or what we can see in the text, an indication. So what Luke focuses in on is the humanity of the Messiah. He's written primarily for the Greeks. Now, what is different about Luke then than, say, Matthew or Mark in his presentation? Because the Greeks had two main things that they constantly wanted to focus on. And that is these two things. They wanted accurate history in chronological sequence. Whereas other ethnic groups, including the Romans, were not so much concerned about chronological history. The Greeks very much were. So back to those verses, you see, he wrote it in chronological order. He makes that statement right at the very beginning. He also says he investigated very carefully. Now, with Luke's status as a medical doctor, he knew how to pay attention to minute detail. And he does that throughout the Gospel of Luke. The other thing that the Greeks had was the concept of an ideal man, both mentally and physically. Now, Mark was the ideal Roman, the servant. Go get it done. For the Greeks, their view of it was different. And we will look at that in a second. But remember this, that we said that when you have the life of the Messiah, everything that Yeshua ever said or did, that the different writers would select different things to point out. And it didn't really matter to them the sequence of things. That's why sometimes when you are reading the Gospels, if you're paying attention, in one Gospel, it looks like it happens at this point in time. In a different Gospel, it looks like it happens at that point in time. The problem is we're reading Matthew and Mark and even John from a sequential mindset that tends to be a more Western mindset. Matthew and Mark and John, but especially Matthew and Mark, are not so concerned about the sequence of things. Remember, they chose certain things out of what Jesus said and what he did that fit their theme. That's why sometimes you have one thing is in one gospel and it's not in another. Other times things are sequenced differently because they weren't concerned about the sequence. When you come to Luke, however, he puts it down. He doesn't do everything that Jesus ever said and did. But he takes the main events and he puts them down in sequential order. So if you want to know how did it happen or when did it happen in the life of Jesus Christ, you have to go to Luke. So Luke saw event A and he wrote it down. And let's just, for argument's sake, that's the first thing in his sequence. And of course, it begins with the birth of the Messiah. He looked at B, and it didn't fit what he was working on as his purpose, Jesus as the Son of Man. But then he looked at C, and it did fit. And he picked out those things that he wanted to use to prove that he was the Messiah. But the big difference is he put them in sequential order. He talked to, many different people who knew Jesus and were the eyewitnesses to make things come out exactly in chronological order. Now, as far as what you're going to see in the Gospel of Luke, it points out the two ideal things that was important to the Greeks, other than the chronological order. And the first was Greek philosophy. In other words, a mental discipline. Not that you find Greek philosophy in Luke, but you see Jesus as a mentally disciplined man, something the Greeks would admire. Secondly, they believed in physical fitness, physical ability. Did you know that today when you go to work out in a gym, that it was the Greeks that started that? And of course, you know about the Olympics. Guess who first started the Olympics? The Greeks. So they had both mental and bodily discipline. That was their ideal person. So the purpose then of Luke is to write that historical account and the life of the Messiah and to show him as a man with both mental and physical discipline. And he writes these things in chronological order. That word, in order, cathexis, it means one after the other, or successively in order, one event after the other as they occurred in the life of the Messiah. And then it also, I had you mark this, it is these things that were handed down to us. Peridoson, it was a Jewish term for something handed down by tradition, but also it could refer to writings. And so it is very true that he probably had access to the Gospel of Matthew, the Gospel of Mark, and he spent time with Mary, he spent time with the apostles, but he himself was not an eyewitness. Luke came to faith in Jesus Christ as a result of Paul's ministry. See, it's just like Sean today, when you led that young man to the Lord, hopefully. You don't know what the Lord may have in that young man's life. You don't know but what that man will go on to be a Luke. You don't know what God's going to be doing. It's just like the person who went into, back in the 1800s, went into a shoe store and shared Christ with a young man who was a shoe salesman. That young man went, by the way, that young man's name was Dwight Lyman Moody, D.L. Moody, the great evangelist of the 1800s that traveled the world, all because somebody went into a shoe store and brought a kid to Christ. He also was part of the early Sunday school movement. The only problem was with D.L. Moody, the church that he was attending, he went on the streets and he got all of these kids, they called them street urchins. Many of them were orphans, but they were just running the streets and all these other kind of things. And they caused such a hubbub in the church that the people said, we can't have all these kids in here. So then what he said, fine. And he went out and rented another building, moved his Sunday school. And there he had, and he won hundreds of those kids to Jesus Christ. Well, anyway. With Luke also, there are three special areas of interest that he had. One, he'll focus on Jerusalem. Two, he'll focus on the Gentiles. 3, he'll focus on women. He shows a great concern for Jerusalem. He recorded events that happened. As a matter of fact, he begins and ends his gospel in Jerusalem. In the Bible, Jerusalem is portrayed as the center of the world. And it's interesting, and the Jews consider it to be the center of the world. You can see that in Isaiah chapter 2, Ezekiel 38, and Ezekiel 5, that it's the center of the world as far as the Lord is concerned. And so there's where Yeshua came. So Luke focuses in on the events happening in and around Jerusalem. The other gospel writers do not focus on these 3 things, but they're very great concern to Luke. He will also show what the second thing is about the Gentiles. Luke shows the things that Jesus taught about the Gentiles that none of the other gospels say. So you can learn a lot about Jesus's thinking about the Gentiles from reading Luke. You won't find that very much in Mark or Matthew. The third thing was his concern for women. Let me ask you a question. How was Jesus's ministry financed? How did he have the money to do what he did? Remember, the disciples all quit their jobs to follow Jesus. Every one of them. How'd they live? Some of them were married. How'd they support their families? How did Jesus manage to survive? You want to know the answer? Nod your head up and down. Wealthy women. It was wealthy women. You can find that in Luke chapter 8, verse 3. Wealthy women were his main support. It's still interesting in the church today, quite often, women are the heavier givers over men. I don't know anything about our giving here at Westside. None of my business. And I said long ago to the treasurers, tell me nothing. I don't want to know who's doing what, when, or where. None of my business. But it wouldn't surprise me that women are heavy givers. Now, it's also unique in the light of the role of women in Judaism, because according to the rabbis, women were a separate people. Many things were required of men that were not required of women. Very few things were required of women that were not required of men. One other thing in the Gospel of Luke, and we're done for this tonight, is that in Luke also we see a lot of Jesus relaxing and talking at meals. The Greeks are famous, like the Romans, for their meals, for their conversation times. The Greeks believe you should never eat a meal alone. Should always, even if you had to have a stranger come in and eat with you, never eat a meal alone. And you see Jesus often at a meal, and he's given his table talk. And that is a singular feature of the Gospel of Luke. I wrote on there Mark, but it's Luke. Okay, that's it. I can't do John tonight. We're out of time. So let me stop this recording, and we will end this session in prayer, and then we'll go through our prayer time.